Welcome to the Whalen Library on Zoom. Tonight we are excited to have Jan Brogan here with us to share her new book, The Combat Zone: Murder, Race, and Boston's Struggle for Justice, which is available at your library and wherever books are sold, also at umasspress.com, and I'll share a discount code that Jan has for us in the chat. Jan Brogan has been a journalist for more than 30 years, working as a correspondent for the Boston Globe, a staff writer for the Worcester Telegram, and for the Providence Journal, where she won the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business Writing. She's the award-winning author of 4 mystery novels: Final Copy, Confidential Source, Yesterday's Fatal, and Teaser. And Steven Soderbergh has purchased the rights to A Confidential Source, which is currently under development. So that's exciting. Jan holds a master's in English from UMass Boston and continues to work as a novelist and journalist, teaching writing at the BU Summer Journalism Institute. Welcome to Jan. I just have a couple of housekeeping notes. First, I'm recording this session for our YouTube page and possible broadcast on Wacam, our local cable access station. So you'll be able to watch and share with friends. And second, Jan will speak for about 35 minutes, and feel free to put your questions in the chat anytime, and I will share them aloud. So now I'll get out of the way and hand it over to Jan. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, and thank you, Courtney, for organizing this, and the Whalen Library for hosting it. When I talk about the combat zone, I like to start this story by kind of putting you back in Boston in the 1970s. And it's hard to, at least I lived in Boston in the 1970s as a student, as a college student, but it's still hard to wrap your head around how poor Boston really was then. Urban cities everywhere were in decline. 76 was the year, or 75, 76 was the year New York City was teetering on bankruptcy, and Boston was not far behind. In fact, it never went bankrupt, but Boston was actually one of the poorest of all cities, and northeastern cities, and Southie actually had the highest concentration of white urban poverty in the nation. There's a couple reasons for that. There was the loss of the shipyard and of manufacturing in the 70s. 128 in the 60s, federal highway laws or programs had built 128 and 495, and those highways, any new business was developed there and not in the city. And unemployment actually in 76 is 15% in the neighborhoods and 20% in the Black neighborhoods. It's just the city lost something like 200,000 of its residents, and so in the 60s, the city had its red light district, and that was Scully Square, and it wanted to get rid of Scully Square, so it got urban renewal money, and it bulldozed. It bulldozed over it, and it built City Hall, Boston City Hall. But those businesses, those adult entertainment, those strip clubs, they just moved down the street to, or new ones popped up, not necessarily the same businesses, but that industry popped up on Lower Washington Street. So, and in the 1970s, there's also this boom. Every other business is kind of fading, or a lot of other businesses is hurting, but the sex entertainment is booming in Boston, and I'll show you. So, and this is the combat zone. Moves down to Lower Washington around Boylston and Washington and LaGrange streets, and backed by Tremont on the other side. It's next to Chinatown. And this is what it looks like in the the early 1970s. And bookstores, it's adult bookstores were big, you know. There was no internet, there's no DVDs. So if you wanted porn, you went to a bookstores, and some of them were just like amazing places. They were, like the Liberty bookstore, which will grow, is not just a bookstore. They've got sex toys, and it's a whole event to go there. And it's so much so that in mid 1976, the Wall Street Journal calls the Combat Zone the sexual Disneyland. It's just full of everything you want. It's got a gay steam bath. It's got uh, strip clubs. It's got bars. It's got some good music. It's also one of the few places in the city where people of different races actually do mix. You will have, black entertainers, and even black men sitting at the bar with white guys. It's like one of the only places in the city where a black interracial couple can rent an apartment upstairs and not get rocks through the window. So it's a kind of a unique spot. But what it also has is crime, because crime has pretty much tripled or quadrupled since the 60s, and the 70s are it's in your face. So there's the problem with the combat zone. If you notice in this picture, the buildings are kind of crappy, and the city's not. This, for example, this is the Hayden building. This is a jewel of architecture, and in the 70s, it's run down. It's, I think, hosting a few adult entertainment businesses. The city is just in decline, and Mayor White is the mayor, and he would really like he's trying to promote this idea of Boston being a world-class city. And there's this whole idea of an architectural spine that is the high rises are going to go from sort of the Mass Ave down to the waterfront, kind of next to the Pike. But there's a black hole in that development of beautiful new skyscrapers, and that black hole is the combat zone. It's ugly, it's dirty, and it's full of crime. So what to do? So they're trying to figure out what to do with this. And there's a problem. They know they can't. Several laws. Like, it's not just Boston that's struggling with this booming pornography business. It's all cities. It's in the 70s that porn has kind of gone a little more mainstream. It's no longer just the black and white stag films that you snuck into a really dirty theater to see. It's some of it's being shown in the big theaters, and it's become kind of chic in this kind of counterculture era. And like dates go to the movies, and it's alarming. It's alarming people that this new kind of social acceptability of porn. So, and then there's also a few. There's a U.S. Supreme Court decision, which makes it harder to define what's obscene, and there's also a state high court decision, which is making it harder for the city to just close down businesses they don't like. So the city feels like it doesn't have that much of a choice, and it sees its only option to contain it. So they feel they can't outlaw these businesses, but if they contain it into a roughly 4-block area, you can make it illegal everywhere else. So this is their plan, to create a 4-block a zoned adult entertainment area, and they vote on this. And it's controversial. It's got its proponents, and it's got its opponents. One of the opponents is Ray Flynn, who will go on to become the next mayor. I think Brighton and I think Back Bay send representatives. They're all for it. Other parts of the city are all for it because they don't want it to spill into their neighborhoods. Chinatown, they get some, which is going to be the neighborhood most impacted by this, kind of gets sold the bill of goods, promise things they never get, and they go along with it. So eventually it passes. I mean, it passes right away, and as part of the zoning, the city has good intentions. It plans to increase policing. It's going to improve it. The Boston Redevelopment Authority is going to work with shop owners to improve signage. It's great, really good things are going to happen. But they allow neon, which is the only part of the city which can have neon lights. So this is very exciting. This gives it a little glamour. And this is pretty much what it looks like in the mid 1970s. But it all goes horribly wrong. And why does it go horribly wrong? It goes horribly wrong for a couple reasons. For one thing, the city, like I mentioned, is broke, and it does not put all the resources. It doesn't get a lot of cooperation from some of the on the improving signage from some of the store owners. So it doesn't get a lot of cooperation, and in turn, it doesn't. People will say that it doesn't clean the streets the same way as other neighborhoods. It doesn't pick up the trash maybe as quickly. But most importantly at all, the policing becomes a problem. And one of the reasons the policing becomes a problem, because at that time, the police in District 1 will be called the most corrupt in the nation. District 1 includes the North End, which, remember, at the time is the headquarters for the mob. It's the state headquarters for the mob. And the mob, which is the Angiulo Boston crime family, buys into it. And this is also an era that you have to remember. The Godfather movie comes out in 72. And this is an era of mob glamour. The mafia is glamorous. And the Angiulo brothers, it's also the peak earning years for them. The mob in general, not necessarily all the Angiulo brothers, but they will come to own at least conservatively 40% of the combat zone businesses. And not to mention how many they have to pay protection to them for operating there. So the mob moves in. Policing is not good. I was very lucky to be able to interview Robert DeGrazia, who was the police commissioner at the time. And I was able to interview him about a year before he passed away. And he told me, we had a very long talk, and he was in San Francisco, and he was hired into the city by Kevin White to clean up corruption in the Boston Police Department. And he said, I knew I was hired to clean up corruption, but it still came as a shock to me to see how deeply corrupt the police department was. That it was he ventured to say the most corrupt in the nation. And one of the reasons it was inclined to corruption is because of the 1919 strike. So in 1919, the police department had a strike, and they all got fired and were replaced en masse. So since 1919, what that means is that a lot of the police entered at an early age and stayed together, right? So they're hired and they retire at about the same time. So that gives them many years to develop their thin blue line. It gives them many years to cover their butts. And also the union is incredibly strong. That's probably the primary reason. The union is just really strong. So DeGrazia is so he is so thwarted in his attempts to clean up the corruption that he actually commissions a secret investigation into his own police department. So this is the police The police commissioner has a secret 2-year investigation into his own police department in District 1. And during this time, he kind of has a falling out with Kevin White, and he loses Kevin White's support. So he's got himself a new job in Maryland. And so he's leaving in 4 days. And he drops this report. It's called the Secret Investigative SIU Unit Report on the newspapers 4 days before he's about to leave when Kevin White is out of town. So, and this document, I think it's 133 pages, will detail police corruption in small ways and large. And that report, which is on the front pages of both papers, it'll be in the radio and on the TV. Basically, it says a couple things. It's just unbelievable what's going on. Police in the combat zone are doing everything from small things like letting mobsters double or triple park without getting tickets, to tipping off the mob about investigations in advance that their own department was doing on the mob, to extorting sex from the prostitutes in the combat zone, and if they were Black, dropping them off in Southie and throwing them out in the car and beeping the horn and going away. They would be turning their gaze away from, turning their backs to a lot of crime that was going on in the combat zone. And and point out, not everybody. Asked him how many people were corrupted on the take, and he said 50% of the cops were good, but at least 50% were on the take. And he said the sad thing was how very little it cost to buy a cop. One of the problems was they made a lot of money by working details in the strip clubs and the bars. So they would wind up drinking for free at the clubs while they were on duty and when they weren't. So that was kind of one of the avenues toward corruption. So let's talk about what it looked like, what kind of crime was going on, what it looked like in the combat zone in the 70s. So if you were standing on LaGrange Street on Saturday night, it would be flooded. Like there would be 60 or more prostitutes milling about on the street outside of Good Time Charlie's, just waiting for the bars to open. There would be prostitutes inside some of the bars selling sex inside some of the bars and strip club back rooms. So there were sex acts going on in alleys. There were sex going on in some of the theaters. Their cars would be stopped in that floor block area. There was a gridlock of traffic, because prostitutes and drug dealers would be stopping people. Traffic would be stopped. They'd be selling sex and drugs through open windows, and cops. There's actually a photo of a cop just looking the other way while it was going on. It was, and so this is, and then also think about this. This is the 70s. Credit cards are not yet that big, although one bar does manage, or one strip club does manage to find a way to allow patrons to buy oral sex by using a credit card, very ingeniously. But for the most part, people are going into the combat zone to tip strippers, to buy drinks, to buy sex, or to buy drugs. They're carrying cash, right? Everyone's, even if you're going in just to get a drink, you're probably carrying cash. So mugging is huge, and pickpocketing is huge. And it's the pickpocketing that will play a big role in the murder of Andy Puopolo. That's the Harvard football player. So, and in this SIU report that details all the different crimes going on in the combat zone and the police corruption, one of the crimes it mentions is something that they refer to as the robber whore scheme, which is not a very nice name, but that's what they called it. And it's basically a pickpocket scheme where women who either were prostitutes or dressed like prostitutes would wait outside the bars, and when the drunk guys came out, they saw anybody, a drunk guy, they would sidle up to him, fondle him, and steal the wallet. So the new wrinkle in this, as detailed by the report, says that that now these women have male protectors, and these male protectors are on hand for a cut of the wallet. They're on hand in case the guy, realizes his wallet is gone and tries to get it back from the woman, prostitute. And DeGrazia, the police commissioner, told me that he knew of some cops, dirty cops, who even acted as the protector for a cut of the wallet. But this is in the news in early November, 1976, and the next week, the Harvard football team, at the end of its season, will celebrate, as is the ritual, the custom, at the Harvard Club. And this is, on I think it's on Com Ave. And it's a lovely evening. There are speeches. Ethel Kennedy flies in to give a special award, a football award, on behalf of her husband's memory. I think Phil Heisman gives the speech. I mean, it's a beautiful evening, and it's not such a great end of the season for the Harvard, which was picked to be the Ivy League champions and come in pretty much. Well, they're not only they're tied with Dartmouth for, I think, third place. So it's been a disappointing season, but the young men are celebrating. And at the end of the evening, it is a custom. It is a Harvard ritual at the time for the football team to leave the Harvard Club and go down to the combat zone for a last drink together. And it sounds like, what a crazy thing to do, especially a week after this special crime unit report talks about the escalation of crime in the combat zone. But it's not just Harvard that does it. I had a friend who played for Boston College, and he told me that they did it too. They just called it force night. It wasn't necessarily after the breakout dinner. And the idea was, you go, it's a dangerous place, but you go en masse, and there are safety in numbers. So one of the football players has a cousin or uncle or something who manages he's involved in the management. So they get him a private room at the back of the Naked Eye, which is known for the time for its renowned for its totally nude college girl review. So they go down and they have themselves a great time in the back room. They've been drinking all night. Some of them even get up on the stage and dance with the stripper, and the bouncer comes in and takes them down, and then they're all pretty much, thrown out of the club at its closing time anyway. So they come out and they spill onto the street, having had a good time. Now, a lot of people after this will say, this is Andy Puopolo. He is the victim. There are actually two Harvard football players stabbed, but Andy Puopolo will be stabbed critically. And one of the many tragedies of this terrible event is that many people will say, because people always want to believe there's a reason someone gets murdered, they'll say, oh, he was at the combat zone. He's the one who got killed trying to get his money back from some stripper. He was there to buy sex, which is absolutely not true. The truth is, when they leave the combat zone, 40 or so football players break up into groups to go home. And Andy Puopolo has already been admitted to one medical school, and he's got exams this week. He's a pre-med. And so he isn't even drinking. He hasn't even been drinking that much, or we don't know at all, because he had he's not a big drinker anyway, but he also had a concussion in the football game on Sunday. So he's not supposed to drink at all. He's already he goes down with one group of Harvard football players. He is already in the back seat of a friend's car, way down on Boylston Street, ready to go home when these events will occur. And what happens is a completely other group of 7 football players. It's actually, I think it's 6 football players and the Harvard equipment manager are leaving the naked eye. They cross Washington Street and onto Boylston, and they go past the Carnival Lounge, which was on the corner at the time. And there are 3 young women out there, and they're Black women, and they're dressed like prostitutes, and they start propositioning the boys as they go by, or the young men as they go by. And a couple of the football players in the front, there are three of them are Black. They're like, get away from us, because people have heard about this robber whore scheme. So the 3 in front say, get out of here. But they keep up. They've got one's in back, and there's one young man who is very drunk and quite obnoxious, and he's talking about how much money is in his wallet. And the women follow them, or depending on the testimony, are probably invited back to the Harvard equipment van, which is parked kind of behind almost kind of the parking lot, kind of adjacent and back from the Carnival Lounge. And they end up back at the van with the football players inside, and at least one of the prostitutes jumps in, and she gets on one of the football players' laps, and they were trying to talk the prostitutes into coming back to the Harvard campus. And she jumps out after about 5 minutes. I don't know what happened in the van, but it doesn't sound like there was much time for too much to happen. She jumps, they're trying to talk her into coming to the campus. She jumps out, and someone says, hey, do you have your wallet? And he looks, and he doesn't have his wallet. And now the football players give chase to the prostitutes. And not all of them. The 3 Black football players stay in the van. And later one of them will say, don't remember this is during busing, and Boston is a racial tinderbox. And they said, there's no way we're getting out and getting in trouble in a Boston city street with the cops. So they stay in the van. The white kids run out. It ends up, the prostitutes divide up, and it ends up with them chasing one of the prostitutes down Boylston Street. These 3 men, this one, Eddie Soares, will come out of the Carnival Lounge and see this young Black woman being chased by about 4 or 5. Originally it's about 4, but originally it's 3 or 4 football players, and then they call their friends to help them. And 2 of the people in the car that Andy Puopolo was in from the front seat jump out to join the chase. It ends up in front of the T station on the edge of the Common at Tremont and Boylston. And while they're there, they're circling Edward Soares, and by most accounts, there are no blows, no punches are actually exchanged. And Tom Lincoln, who is the other football player who will be stabbed, says, what are we doing here? He doesn't have the wallet. Let's go home. And just as he says that, this man, Leon Easterling, jumps into the crowd and stabs him. As soon as they see the knives, they scream. Someone, I think the equipment manager, says, they've got knives, get out of here. They all run about a block, almost a full block, back to where the Harvard van is parked. They jump inside, and all of them will get into the van, except for the kid, Charlie, who actually who the loudmouth with the wallet, and the young man who, obviously they were all drinking and their behavior was bad, and he's being punched when these three follow them back to, they give chase. They're back. They chase them back to the van, and they're joined by another man of indeterminate race, who will be described in the testimony as white, black, Hispanic, and Danny Puopolo, the victim's younger brother, always wondered if maybe he was Italian, because he's the only one who doesn't get arrested and is never found. But we don't really know. We just know he's the one who pulls Charlie out of the van and is beating him against the van, which is shaking from. And when Andy Puopolo has by this time gotten out of the car, walked down the block to see what's going on, and when he gets there, he sees that that his teammate is being beaten against the van, and at the point he sees no one else is helping him, so he jumps in to help. He winds up getting into a fist fight with Edward Soares. This is going around the van, and Leon Easterling jumps over his back to stab Andy in the stomach. At this point, one of the football players, the teammates who has also come late to this, sees that, picks Andy up and says, "Let's get the hell out of here. Are you all right?" And Andy says, "Yeah, I am all right." And he picks him up, and they're headed across the street when Leon Easterling follows them and stabs him a second time, this time into the stomach and up, twisting up into the heart. And the medical evidence will support this. So Andy is luckily Tufts is like 3 minutes away. So they get him to Tufts. He is dead on arrival when he gets there, but they're able to restart his heart. And the whole city, I mean, and so this story becomes a huge story, not just in Boston. The next day, this will be covered by more than 300 newspapers across the country, from Maine to Montana to the Stars and Stripes in Japan. While he is in surgery, the family and his younger brother Danny Puopolo becomes an important figure in this book, because the family is called in, and Danny is 19 years old, 2 years younger than his brother, and they were very close. And his brother was his hero. And his brother had actually asked him to come meet the guys at the combat zone that night for a drink. And Danny says, no, you go together. This is your last, spend your time with your teammates. And he will spend the rest of his life regretting that, thinking, as siblings often do, guilty. And he will come to believe it is his duty to avenge this murder. His first plan is to get justice for Andy. And he wants full justice. And at that time, what the prosecutor will say is that the prosecutor is Tom Mundy, who was really a quite very professional, very renowned prosecutor. He will win the state. He will recover from this case and go on to become named the first prosecutor of the year awards. And he will try some very, very important cases. But so what he decides at this time is that all three of these men are charged with murder in the first degree. So, and why are all three of them charged? So it's obvious why Leon Easterling is charged. You can also argue why Edward Soares is, he was at a fist fight with him. Maybe he had a blow to the head. I mean, you could see some of the logic. Richard Allen struck no blows. He hit nobody, but he was there. He was there with them. He was a bouncer at the Carnival Lounge. at the time. Uh, why they're all charged is because the prosecutor believes they were all working as protectors for the prostitute. So remember that robber whore scheme? He believes that the three of them were working in concert. So thus, you can use joint venture. It's kind of like the felony murder rule. If the bank robber shoots somebody inside the bank and kills somebody, the guy who drove the getaway car is just as guilty. It's like that. He's also using joint venture in two ways. He's saying not only is there a conspiracy, he said there's a conspiracy, and even if there weren't, because they were all up at that tea stop together when Leon Easterling stabbed Tom Lincoln, the other Harvard football player, they knew that he had a knife and would use it. So that once they chase the Harvard football players back to the van, it becomes premeditation, and they're all equally guilty. So this murder happened in November 15th, 1976. Andy dies in mid-December 1976. This will go to trial by March 1977. That's 3 months after the murder. That never happens today. Never. They get, and you got to remember too, the defense in this is going to be pro bono, right? These guys can't afford high quality, or they can't afford the high priced, they're not calling in Athlete Bailey. So the defense has 3 months to prepare. One of those defense attorneys is Henry Owens. He will represent Richard Allen. Henry Owens at the time is probably the most prominent, most successful Black attorney in Boston at the time. He's come up. He's been concerned about the civil rights of Black defendants, and one of the things that he's been worried about is jury selection, because at the time it was standard operating procedure, and not just in Boston. This is across the nation. It was standard operating procedure for any prosecutor to use his peremptory challenges to get rid of any Blacks on the jury if the defendants were Black. Now, this goes both ways too. If it was a defense, if the defense was defending a white man against a Black, was defending a white defendants against in the murder of a Black by whites, he would want Blacks on the jury, and the prosecutor might try to get rid of the whites. In this particular case, the defense used their peremptory challenges to get rid of pretty much every single potential juror that had an Italian last name, for fear that they would be too sympathetic to the victim. So, and that was happening everywhere. Henry Owen had watched, and in Boston, there's not a huge, when the jury pool from the selection, that like the big pool that comes down that you're going to select from, there aren't that many Blacks on it anyway, because there aren't that, the Blacks are 16%, I think 16% of the population. And because of the way they call the jurors, they do it by voting, by registered voting, and Blacks tend not to register to vote at the same rate. So there are very few Blacks in the jury to start off with. And Henry Owens will say he watched Tom Mundy get rid of them, each one, time after time after time. So he knows this. He also, the judge, so you have to remember, once this happens in November, the city, this is like such a turning point. Also the same week, later that week, a state trooper is killed in the combat zone. There's some sort of fist fight and he dies of a heart attack, but it happens the same week. So first thing the new police superintendent does is flood the combat zone with police. It pretty much shuts it down. and at the same time, the Suffolk County District Attorney, and this is Boston and Suffolk County, and Tom Mundy is an assistant district attorney, and Garrett Byrne is the district attorney, and he is well known for hating the combat zone, and he has had his own investigation into the corruption going on, and he wants to shut. They all want to shut everyone. A lot of people want to shut the combat zone. As a matter of fact, the day after the murder, Ray Flynn will go to the combat zone with petitions to get people to sign to have it closed down. Ray Flynn, if you remember, was a football. He was a professional football player basketball player. He's a very good basketball player, and he was a pro for a little bit. And he had actually coached Andy Puopolo as a youth, and knew him, not well, but he knew him. So he was very struck by this murder. So there is so much public pressure going on about shutting down the combat zone. So the judge is chosen for this case is Judge Roy, and he is known as the hanging judge. And Henry Owen says he's always chosen to sit on the case when the Commonwealth absolutely needs a conviction. So he feels from the beginning that his client has no chance. He also he asks Judge Roy to separate the cases. Henry Owens believes that Leon Easterling is guilty of murder in the first degree. Edward Soares is guilty of at least manslaughter, but that his client is completely innocent, which he didn't touch anybody. So he wants his case separated from the other two, but Judge Roy won't let that happen. So these men they're going to choose a jury, and they're choosing a jury in a period of time in Boston where, to say that it was, I think to say a racial war was going on would actually be almost underselling it. There is so much violence going on, racial violence going on in the city. This is, busing. Busing has started, I think, in the first year, 75, I think. This is the second year of implementation. The neighborhoods had been resisting busing for many years. The school committee, this is Louise Day Hicks, the feds have been trying to get Boston to desegregate its schools for a long time. They have given them ample opportunity to come up with their own plans. They have suggested magnet schools, which would have been a great solution. And Louise Day Hicks and others just resisted at every turn. So by the time Judge Paul Garrity issues his busing plan, it's pretty much punitive, and it starts by busing, I think, to Southie from Mattapan, or it begins, and then it's Charlestown, and it couldn't have been handled worse. And someone told me when I spoke at another library that they ran into Judge Garrity like many years later, and they asked him, if you had to do it all over again, would you? And he said, absolutely not. There is so much violence. At one point, a kid gets stabbed at Southie. A black kid stabs a white kid in the library at Southie High School. By the time they get him to the hospital, the high school is surrounded by 2,000 or 3,000 people. At the hospital, the high school is surrounded by 2,000 or 3,000 people. They have to get the police in. There's choppers overhead. They can't figure out how to get the students out of the school safely. They can't get the black kids home. So finally, Louise Day Hicks actually comes and asks, with a bullhorn, asking people to go home, and they tell her and then she's like their hero. They tell her to shut up and get out of there. They finally get them out by a feint. But, people are overturning police cruisers. I mean, it is wild. Afterwards, the school will be closed for at least, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. And there are rumors going around that people are going to blow up, that the bridges and tunnels of Boston are all going to be blown up. And this is taken seriously. I mean, the violence is so intense that by the time they do their first official count in 78, when it has calmed down a little, there are 604 reports of racial violence in the first year they counted. That's all racial violence. That we're not talking about other hate crimes. We're just talking about racial violence. So that's 604. That's like 2 a day then those are the ones that are reported. So this is how violent it is. So they're calling a jury, right? So they're getting together a jury that'll be called from Suffolk County. So they're coming from the Boston neighborhoods. I think Revere and Chelsea are included, but it's mostly the Boston neighborhoods. And as Henry Owens will say, this is not really a group of people inclined to consider the civil rights of the Black defendants. They're angry. Their kids are being bussed. Everyone's angry. So he knows from the beginning, Henry Owens has a plan from the beginning. And he says, my only shot at this is on the jury selection, is getting an appeal. So from the very first day of jury selection, he is in there. And every time Tom Mundy strikes a Black juror using his peremptory challenge, he objects. He makes a note for the record, to the judge. And Tom Mundy will reject 11 out of 12 potential Black jurors. And at the final jury, we'll have one Black on the jury, and he will be the foreman. All right, so that jury, it takes about 2 weeks to seat the jury. It only takes, I think, something like 8 days, and they're all sequestered. So they actually, the trial goes on during the weekend. I think it's 8 days for them to 8 days. It's something like 8 days for them to try the case. So they will get their jury instructions. I think it's on a Thursday at noon, and begin to deliberate. They will deliberate that afternoon and less than an hour in the morning, and they will come back and they will find them all guilty in the first degree. At that point, obviously the Puopolo family has been told that this is justice, and they believe this is justice, and they're happy about it. Up until this point, the support has been with the family, but at this moment, it kind of shifts. The newspaper coverage completely changes, and now it's, harsh justice, and it's known as the racist trial. And so one of the terrible things about losing someone to murder for the victims is, in a case like this, it's such a public tragedy, and the newspaper coverage. I mean, they follow the family newspaper, and I, was a newspaper reporter, but they follow them to the hospitals. They're waiting in their yard. They're in the court. When they're even outside the funeral home when he goes to bring the suit that his son's going to wear when he gets laid out. I mean, it's just, and the father is very gracious. He's a very sympathetic person, and he'll be a very sympathetic witness, a very convincing witness. But at this point, people will still say to them, "Oh, it's so sorry it's so sorry to hear about your son. But what was he doing in the combat zone anyway?" As if he deserved this. And this is something that's very common in a lot of the studies they've done a lot of studies on this since the 80s, the late 80s. It begins in the late 80s through the 90s, with when there was so much urban crime. But one of the really sad things is that people are always looking for a reason there's a murder that it won't happen to them. So if they could say, what was he doing in the combat zone? They don't, what was he doing? And the other thing they know is that it caused PTSD, particularly for anybody in their adolescence. So Danny is 19 when this happens. This has got to be the most traumatizing thing anybody could ever experience. Not just the murder, but the months in the hospital when strangers were coming in, psychics were coming in to pray for him. And the whole, like, thinking that he was going to come, it was a miracle and he was going to recover, and he doesn't. And then it becomes the murder becomes a political football. And one of the things that's very common, even if it explains a lot about gang warfare in the cities. If you're like a 17, 18, or 19-year-old, you watch your friend get murdered in the street, it's very likely you get PTSD, and part of that PTSD is wanting revenge. That's a really common symptom of PTSD. They know that. And Danny will, so this trial, eventually they will take this, they will appeal it on two grounds. They'll say there's not enough evidence to convict all three defendants, and jury selection was wrong. So the high court will look at everything and they will say, no, actually, there's plenty of evidence to support joint venture conviction of all three of them. There's plenty of evidence to support that, given the definitions of joint venture. There's evidence of premeditation. That's true, but jury selection's wrong. So we have to have a new trial. So what the family hears from that is there's enough evidence to convict them, and now they're off on a technicality, right? So this will be retried this is a picture of Danny. Everyone who reads the book, when I talk about book clubs, always wants to know what Danny looks like. This is Andy Puopolo and the father, and this is at the dedication of the North End. The family they lived in the North End. They moved to Jamaica Plain when the boys are like in their teenage years, but they also have a family business in the North End, and their grandparents in the North End, and they play sports in the North End. So they have strong ties to the North End. The North End gets together, and they get the park where Andy grew up playing sports on Commercial Street, on that waterfront park, and that becomes dedicated as Andrew Puopolo Park. So and this is the monument to him. You cannot find someone who has a bad word to say about Andy Puopolo. And one of the really sad things is, for the family particularly, they will become known as that racist trial, the Puopolo trial. And Andy Puopolo, from all accounts, and I talked to a lot of his friends at Harvard and Boston Latin who were Black. He was one of the few who actually had a lot of Black friends. So he's probably the least racist, particularly for that era. So the world will change. Not the world, but Boston will change between 1977, this conviction, and when the trial is retrialed in 1979. The new jury will have new rules on how to select jury, and there will be, I think, 3 on the sitting jury, and I think 2 alternates. They will come to a very different conclusion. I won't say exactly what, so that you read my book. But what's really interesting is what went on in Boston between these 2 trials to change the outcomes, and that's very much the city exploding with more racial violence. This time it's out of the schools and into the community, for the most part, and finding out that a lot of all white juries, in several instances I won't go into because I think I'm running out of time, where all white juries let white defendants off the hook for killing Blacks. And the Globe will do a study which shows that at this time, Blacks are sentenced to much longer sentences for the same crime as whites. And so there's a lot going on. And also, I think it's a week or 2 weeks before this trial will be trialed, Daryl Williams. And I don't know if anybody remembers him. He was a 15-year-old Black football player, another football player, but this one a high school player, full of promise, from a lovely family, and he will be playing football on the Charlestown field, and 3 white youths, snipers, will shoot him from the top of a rooftop and hit the back of his neck, and he will be paralyzed for the rest of his life. And at the time of this trial, he's in a coma, and they actually think he's going to die. And I think this is the moment in Boston where violence, like white violence against Black, has finally gone too far. Now during busing, there's a lot of violence back and forth. It's not all white on Black. It's Black on white as well. But the statistics show there's more white on Black than Black on white. So this is the moment, and people are sick of busing. They're sick of the protests. A lot of the busing controversy dies down because pretty much all the whites take their kids out of the school system. They move to towns like Wayland and Westwood, where I raised my kids, and or they send their kids to parochial schools. So so that's why a lot of the racial fights move into the neighborhoods. And there's also another incident that gets tried where so those 3 white kids who shot Darrell Williams, although it's debatable whether they actually, there's some question about whether they knew he was Black. I mean, he was pretty far away. He's got a football, and whether they could shoot him if they said they were shooting pigeons. But anyway, they will actually serve more time for like ripping off a local convenience store than they'll get for this shooting. And there's I think it's the end of 78. It's tried at 78. There's a tour group from Philadelphia of a field trip of some sort of Christian school that's Black in Philadelphia, and they come up to see Bunker Hill. And after they leave the monument, 3 white guys with a baseball bat and hockey sticks beat them, and they'll be transported to the hospital. And this will go to trial, and 3 white guys will be arrested, but an all-white jury will acquit them. Now, there is some, in that particular instance, there is some, like, and I've read some of the transcripts that some of the Black witnesses said, I really can't identify them. I really can't say they're the ones. And there is some question about whether the police got the right guys. But it's the kind of thing that happens over and over again in Boston, so it infuriates everybody. And I think this is the period when Boston starts a long road of improvement. Now, let's talk about the combat zone. The combat zone will the murder of Andy Puopolo, that is when the BRI says, that's it. We got to shrink the combat zone. And from that point on, they will do a lot of different things to shrink the combat zone as best they can. They will bring in, basically they're bringing in more expensive tenants that will raise the rate, that will overall raise the cost of renting there. This is and like during the 80s, that's when a lot of these bars and strip clubs move out to like Peabody and Stoughton. The combat zone won't really, because this is the only place you can have these businesses in Boston. So when one closes, sometimes another one appears, but it is shrinking over this period. It won't really die until the VCR is invented. And you don't need to go to the combat zone to see porn. And the internet will take prostitution off the street and put it on your home computer. So this is what the combat zone looks like today. That's left. There's only 2 bars, the Silver Slippered and Centerfolds. That's LaGrange Street. This is where 60 prostitutes used to hang out on Saturday night. And this is what LaGrange Street looks today. It's all luxury condominiums. So I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. I'd love to hear from you. I also note Stephanie Shoro is in the audience. Stephanie Shoro wrote The Combat Zone, which is which is a fabulous book, and it talks more about the combat zone. If you want know more about the combat zone, you should definitely read her book because it's fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jan. This is awesome. Fascinating. If anyone has a question, feel free to unmute or put it in the chat, but I get to start. I'm just wondering what prompted you to write this book. How did you end up here?
So I wrote 4 murder mysteries that were published like in the early 2000s. And when I was done with my last murder mystery, which was Teaser, I was actually sick of making up awful things for people to do to each other. And I kept saying, if I'm going to write a book, I want to find a story that I felt really needs to be told. And I just kept saying, I want to find a story that needs to be told. I was living in Westwood then, and I said that at enough, I think, Christmas parties that I was in Costco one day, and a friend came up to me and said, "Jan, do you write screenplays?" And I said, "Well, I have written them, but nothing I consider successful." I said, and I don't just mean like successful, it's been made into a movie. I mean successful, even I like it. So I said, why? And he said, because Danny Puopolo is looking for a screenwriter. And Danny Puopolo also lived in Westwood. And I said, why the hell is Danny Puopolo looking for a screenwriter? And he said, remember that murderer, the football player? And I said, oh yeah, that's his brother. So I wound up meeting with Danny, and that they had a director. He was Andrew Cadiff, who was the director of Spin City, the TV show, and Home Improvement, and had done a couple films. But they needed a screenplay, and they didn't have money for a screenplay. And I said, okay, I will write the screenplay on spec, which means you don't get paid until it gets made into a movie, which means you never get paid. So I said, I will write this on spec if I have the right to write a book. And I will write the screenplay the way you want me to, but I'm a journalist. So if I write the book, I have to write the book the way I want, the way I see it as a journalist. And we signed a contract to that effect. And I worked with Danny. I don't know. This is like, took a year to write the book proposal. It took a year to write the screenplay, a year to write the book proposal. And then first my agent couldn't sell it. I dropped the project. That's when I met Stephanie. And then I got an email out of the blue from the publisher, which was First University Press of New England, that they wanted to go forward and give me an advance. And I started writing the book. They gave me an advance. I started half my advance. I started writing it. I delivered it in 2018 and on my new deadline. And they promptly, 3 weeks later, they announced they were going out of business. So then I had to find another publisher, and I found UMass Press. And so this book took 10 years, but not solid 10 years.
Wow. And that screenplay is different from the TV program in development now.
So the confidential source that just came
sorry,
out.
I got confused. That's
yeah. No, so this is the confidential source was my second murder mystery. It's set in Rhode Island. Michael Carenti, who did Federal Hill. He's best known for his film Federal Hill. He and Outside Providence. He contacted me and he asked me if he got an option on it because he wanted to do a screenplay. He wound up getting Steven Soderbergh. They actually wound up, first they optioned it, then they bought the rights. Then they had it all set to go before COVID started. And now I haven't heard anything. So, but they paid me. Yeah. So that's, they paid me more than I ever thought I'd get. So, I have to be happy with that.
That's great. Stephanie actually entered a question that she says, you wrote this book with such passion, but you have a background as a journalist. How did you balance that in your mind?
I try to be, well, I think as a journalist, you talk to the other side. And once you talk to the other side, and if you talk to enough people on the other side, and you really listen to them, and your mind is open, which doesn't happen a lot today. Your mind is open. You feel an obligation to represent their side of the story. And that's how I feel. I mean, I was really torn. Like Danny had the transcript to the first trial, and then I hunted down the transcript to the second trial. And when I read the first trial, I I didn't feel like Monday proved that, that there was a joint venture of that these men worked with these prostitutes, not all of them. And I thought that it was kind of an easy sell. I thought that I understood the premeditation argument, but I just, and I think that joint venture is a hard sell. It's really hard to put three people away from murder for life, no parole, when only one of them really did the murder. So I wrote in my very first proposal, I saw this very differently than Danny did. I didn't think that the first trial was fair, and I don't think the second trial was fair either. I think I don't think either of them are fair, and I just stuck to my guns.
Great. Could you talk a little bit about your sources? You mentioned interviews, the court reporting.
Oh yeah. So I was really lucky because Danny had been working with his friend Francis Torella, and they had been collecting a lot of documents for the. So I started, and the transcripts were like a pot of gold, because if he didn't have nobody, he had the only copy, right?
Oh, wow.
So, and I must have, and that's like it's like probably 1,500, 2,000 pages. I read them at least 3 times.
Wow.
And then there are supporting documents from the prosecution. I talked to the defense attorneys. I got their documents. I had to hunt down this. My biggest feat is finding this transcript to the second trial because nobody had them. I called out the lawyer. Nobody had a transcript from the second trial. I finally found them at the social law library. But at the social law library, it cost like, I don't know. It was a 4,000 page transcript. They only actually had on microfiche. They only actually had 1,200 pages, I think. But I had to figure out how to copy them because the copying I was like outrageous. Like, I don't know, 50 cents a page or 20. It was, and so I just got fined. And a friend of mine said, you can get an app on your phone. So I sat there with my microfiche and photocopied each page.
Wow.
With my iPhone scanner. I was there 3 weeks doing that. And I probably have the only hard copy of those transcripts. Known to mankind. I talked to the lawyer. Henry Owens is really helpful. Norman Zalkine, who represents Easterling in the second trial, was just immensely helpful. And Andrew Good was helpful. Mundy was dead. That's really the bad thing about 40 years ago. A lot of people are dead, especially the jurors, because in those days, too, a lot of the jurors tended to be retirees because the way they chose the jury was people who could afford the time. So I really tried a lot of ways to hunt down the jury on both juries. I couldn't, and their names weren't published in the second trial. So that was a brick wall. Leon Easter, all the 3 defendants were dead. So with Tom Mundy, a lot of his colleagues talked to me, and that was extremely helpful. So I could build. He became very close with the Puopolo family, who adored him. So they knew quite a bit about him. I was able to, and from particularly a couple of his friends, I was able to construct, I think, a really good portrait of him. The defendants were really hard. Leon Easterling's wife was going to talk to me, and we had a date all set up in New Hampshire. And I asked her if you could, I'd love to talk to the whole family. She called me and said, no, we can't talk. The family has shut me down. They do not want to talk about it. They don't want me to talk about it. So I had to get very creative, and I found people who had known him when he lived in Philadelphia, and then some people, the bartenders who knew him, some of his friends of Edward Soares. And so through their attorneys and some of their friends in the combat zone is how I was able to construct what little I could of the defendants. But I've learned a lot since. Well, one of the funny stories about this is when I wrote the screenplay, Danny was told that Leon Easterling was dead. And I wrote the screenplay with this because it was a screenplay, you fictionalize. There's no fiction in my book, but in the screenplay, we fictionalize the end. And I have this scene with and I felt free to do it because Leon Easterling was dead.
Yeah.
But when I started on the book, I went to Universal Hub. They had a thread on the combat zone, and I asked anybody knew them. And I get this email. It's like, "Hi, I'm Leon Easterling. I hear you're looking for me."
Oh my God.
And it was, and I said, at first I didn't believe it, but I did all these questions. It was Leon Easterling,
Wow.
and he wanted to meet and talk about it, but he wanted me to pay him.
Oh.
And journalists don't pay.
Hmm.
And at one point, when I was thinking, when I was like, before he announced that I had to have a price, Danny said, "I'll go with you. You shouldn't go alone." I was like, "No, I'm not. You're not coming."
No.
But I knew that would be a good idea because, but Leon Easterling died. There was this hiatus when I couldn't sell the book, and then when the publisher came back to me. So in that time, Leon Easterling died.
Hmm.
So, but I was able to track down some things, and I've since, in these talks, sometimes people come up to me, or they email me. I had tried to find the prostitutes who were involved, and I had emailed like last known address, because you can't call people anymore
Yeah.
because nobody answers their phone, right? And so I'm writing people, and she actually, the daughter of the prostitute got back to me on email and said, "I'm so sorry. I just got this now. I understand you were looking for us. I can't tell you a lot about she had been born when this happened."
Wow.
She said, "My grandmother raised me. My mother was a very troubled woman with drugs, and she died young." So,
Wow.
oh, and actually for a while, Leon Easterling was following me on Twitter and Facebook.
Wow. That's surreal.
That was kind of weird.
Wow. Well, this is fascinating. Does anyone else have a question? I'm just also so grateful for the way you set it up, with setting the combat zone setting and the history of that place, and just sort of this picture of everything being squeezed smaller and smaller and then exploding.
Yeah.
But I just want to say thank you on the behalf of the library and everyone here tonight for a great talk. And we're looking forward to checking out the book.
Okay, I just want to mention that there's a discount code. Again, there's a discount code in the chat,
Yeah.
which is 30% off and free shipping when you go direct to UMass Press. So it's also available on Amazon and best of all at your local bookstore.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Jan.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks, Stephanie.
Great night.
Bye.
Bye.